We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When Stephen Miles was deeply unpopular, he went on a spending spree to try and help him reset and gain his popularity back. Mr Miles was willing to sacrifice the state's finances to try to make people like him again. The Prime Minister played this card trick on the weekend with his $16 billion university degree debt policy. Prime Minister, our country is off track, and this Labor government is damaging the economy and keeping interest rates higher for longer, which is hurting families. When will the reckless spending stop?
Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. There's far too much noise during that question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question, and I give him credit for having the courage to come to the dispatch box, having been part of a government that left a $78 billion deficit that we turned into a $22 billion surplus, and then produced a second surplus the year after, from an opposition that, when they were in government, left $1 trillion of debt, reading as far as the eye could see.
Order. The member for Grey.
But what we have done in government is to halve inflation. When we came to government, it had a 6 in front of it, and today it has a 2 in front of it. And we've done that while we've created on our watch 1 million jobs. The first time that has ever happened by any government in any term since Federation. At the same time, we've got real wages increasing. They've increased by more since we came to government than occurred under their previous 9 long years. And what we have also done is provide cost of living relief when it's been necessary. Done it in a way that is responsible. But they've never seen any cost of living relief they didn't want to bag. They've never supported any of it, so it's not surprising they're not supporting this relief either. What this is about is cutting student debt by 20%. The first thing we'll do, if we're re-elected, we will introduce legislation. 3 million people will benefit. A typical university graduate will see their debt cut by $5,500. Now, as a direct result of what the former government did, the Morrison government, by lowering the threshold in which payments have to come back, for some people, their interest is more than their original debt, the interest that they are paying. That is a direct result. So we're also raising the student debt repayment threshold from $54,000 to $67,000 and lowering the repayment rate. If you're earning $70,000 a year, you'll save $1,300 a year in repayments. But in addition to that, we are also making free TAFE permanent. Already 500,000 Australians have benefited. More tradies to build homes, more apprentices getting a start, more carers to look after our loved ones, more opportunities for Australians. We understand that education is the key to opening those doors of opportunity, and we want to widen them. That's what this government's about, and I'm proud of the announcements that we made over the last few days. And over the coming days and weeks and months, there'll be more about what our second-term agenda looks like.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease rejecting. When the House comes to order, we'll hear from the honourable member for Macnamara.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to support Australians with a student debt, and what has been the response?
Order. The member for Gippsland is warned. No one is to interject before a minister begins their answer. Same rules are applying. The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the fantastic member for Macnamara, for his question. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that if we win the next election, the first legislation that we introduce to Parliament will cut all student debts by 20%. And that will help 3 million Australians right across the country, including 27,000 people in the electorate of Macnamara. They're people with a uni degree. They're also people with a TAFE qualification.
Order.
And if they have got the average student debt of, say, 27 grand, that'll wipe $5,500 off their bill. And if they've got a debt of 50 grand, it'll wipe about $10,000 off their bill. That's a lot of help for a lot of young Australians just out of uni, just out of TAFE, maybe moving just out of home, just getting started. And if we win the next election, we'll also make it easier for them to pay off those debts. You won't have to start paying it off until you earn $67,000. In other words, you won't have to start paying it off until going to uni or going to TAFE starts to pay off for you. We'll also reduce the minimum payments that they have to make each year. And so if you're earning about $75,000, we'll reduce the repayments that you have to make next year by about $1,000. That's an extra $1,000 in your pocket rather than the government's. That's real cost of living relief, cutting their debt and reducing their repayments. It's all part of building a better and a fairer education system. It's all part of building Australia's future. And guess who wants to stop all of this? The Liberal Party. That's what they said on the weekend. Well, at least 3 million Australians now know where they stand. That's everyone from chippies and sparkies with a TAFE qualification to teachers and nurses with a uni degree. They now know that if Labor wins the next election, we'll cut their debt by 20%. And if the Liberals win, they won't. They know that Labor will help them and the Liberals will dud them. That's what they'll be doing, dudding 3 million Australians, making them pay thousands more in debt, making it harder to pay off, harder to get started and harder to get ahead. That's what's happened. That's what we've got now with the modern Liberal Party, anti-education, anti-aspiration. This Prime Minister wants to open the doors of opportunity wider. This opposition leader wants to slam them shut.
But before I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I didn't sit through that answer and continually say order, order the way through. I shouldn't have to. But in that answer, the member for O'Connor interjected 11 times continuously. So he will leave the chamber under 94A. Order. I shouldn't have to continually chide members. I'm going to try something different this week and ask everyone to lift their standards and improve the amount of interjections, or decrease the amount of interjections. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Is Australia in a household recession?
Give the call to the order and give the call to the Prime Minister.
We know. I thank the Deputy Leader for her question. What we know
Leader of the Opposition.
Many Australians are doing it tough. They have had a difficult period, and it's been a difficult period in the global economy.
The member for Herbert.
A difficult period in the global economy. But if you look at what we are doing, those 1 million Australians who have found additional work, so that more people are working than ever before, that is a result of this government's policies. When you look at the participation rate, it's at 67.2%. When you look at—
Prime Minister is 40 seconds into the answer, so he was reading out statistics about the economy, and the question was about a specific part of the economy the Deputy Leader asked. So, order. The Leader of the Opposition will need to cease sitting so I can hear the point of order from the Deputy Leader.
The point of order is on relevance, Mr Speaker. It was a tightly worded question. A household recession is a technically defined term, and we would expect a yes or no answer.
Order. Order. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the demand of the standing orders is that the answer be relevant to the terms of the question, and anything that goes to the financial situation of households in Australia is clearly relevant to the terms of the question.
As I was making the point, as long as the Prime Minister is being directly relevant regarding facts and figures, obviously I don't know if he's going to give a yes or no answer. I can appreciate the Deputy Leader would like that, but under the standing orders, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is warned and won't interject for the remainder of this question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. We understand that many households are under pressure. It's precisely why we gave a tax cut to every Australian taxpayer, all 13.6 million of them, not just some. But what was going to happen under their plan was that we were all going to get a tax cut, but low and middle income earners were going to miss out. And they're still justifying. They're still justifying their old scheme.
Order.
And we look forward, we wait for their policy to claw back the tax cuts that they've called waste. In addition to that, of course, we have provided energy price relief for every single household. In addition to that, we have provided for cheaper medicines, something that those opposite also opposed and said would be a disaster. We've introduced 60-day dispensing, literally cutting the costs in half. And those opposite, and I take the interjection from the Leader of the National Party, who said, how much did it cost you, the 60-day dispensing? What he doesn't say, and he should interject, is how much did people benefit? How much did pensioners, when they go to the pharmacy and they get cheaper medicine? Because that's what we provided. So on the one hand, they ask a question about households, and at the same time they interject about every single measure that we have put in place, whether it's cheaper childcare, cheaper medicines, energy price relief, tax cuts for all of these measures making a difference. Fee-free TAFE making a difference. The measures that we introduced or we announced yesterday, they've already said they'll oppose. There's not a single cost of living measure that those opposite are prepared to support.
When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How will the Albanese Labor government help ease the cost of living for students and young people in a responsible way, and what alternatives are there?
Call to the Treasurer.
Speaker, thanks very much, and thanks to the member for Moreton for his question. We're going to miss you, mate, when you retire at the first half of next year. But young Leo and young Stan will get a bit more time with the old man, and that's a good thing as well, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Moreton understands, as we do, that even with inflation coming off considerably and the progress that we've made in the economy, we know that people are still under pressure. And we also know that that pressure is often felt disproportionately by young people, including people who are carrying a lot of student debt. And this is part of the intergenerational unfairness in our economy, which we are determined to address in a responsible way. It's why we made the tax cuts fairer for young people. It's why we increased rent assistance twice and building more homes. It's why we're already legislating to make the indexation of student debt fairer. And it's why I want to pay tribute to this Prime Minister, Education Minister and Skills Minister for the three important announcements that they made on the weekend. First, to make fee-free TAFE a permanent feature of our system. Secondly, to lift the amount of money people can earn before they start paying student debt back. And thirdly, to slash that debt by 20%. This is all about easing cost of living pressures and lifting some of the burden on young people. It means more Australians keeping more of what they earn and paying back less debt. Now, Mr Speaker, not everybody in this House thinks we should help students and graduates with the cost of living. Those opposite want Australians to have more student debt, not less. They couldn't care less about the pressures that young people are facing in our country. Now, these are the same characters who say they oppose these changes on economic and fiscal grounds, the same people who left us much higher inflation and much more debt in the budget. When they were in office, inflation had a 6 in front of it, and now it has a 2 in front of it. It was much higher and rising under them, and now it's lower and falling under us. We've more than halved inflation in our time in office, and debt is $150 billion lower under us because of our responsible economic management has been cleaning up the mess that those opposite left behind. Now, Mr Speaker, our responsible economic management has meant that we can get the budget in better nick and make room for what really matters, for the things that our society really treasures and values, Mr Speaker. Easing the cost of living and lifting some of the debt burden on young people is a really important part of that effort. Now, those opposite would throw it all away, and they would make life harder for young people and for Australians more broadly. And that is one of the many real risks and one of the many real costs of the reckless arrogance of this opposition leader. This side of the House wants to make life easier for young people. That side of the House wants to make it harder, and that's been made very clear in the last 24 hours.
Before I call the member for Clark, I'll just do some acknowledgements in the gallery today. He will get the call. I'm honoured to inform the House that we are joined today by Mr Adam Jogee, MP, member for Newcastle under Lyme in the United Kingdom Parliament. And also, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is former member for Hunter and former Cabinet Minister, the Honourable Joel Fitzgibbon. And I'm also pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today are recipients of the Stronger Medicare Awards, awarded in recognition of those who have gone above and beyond to improve the lives and health outcomes of all Australians. On behalf of members, I congratulate you and wish you a warm welcome to Question Time. I give the call to the honourable member for Clark.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, in an interview on ABC Perth on 24 September, you defended your government's refusal to implement a complete ban on the advertising of sports and online gambling by saying the problem is overwhelmingly poker machines. So, why don't you use the Corporations Act or the Commonwealth's tax powers to implement harm minimisation measures nationally on poker machines? Or is the reality that the Labor Party is simply in the pockets of the predatory gambling companies?
Order. I want to hear from the Leader of the House on this.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. The last part of that question offends standing orders in a number of ways, including obviously being an imputation.
The standing orders are pretty clear, and I just want to refer to members. Particularly, I'm going to rule that last part of the question out. Standing Order 100D4 is clear that questions must not contain imputations. So I'm going to take this opportunity to remind all members this is a warning. Other speakers in similar circumstances have ruled the entire question out when this starts creeping into the questions. So it's a warning for every member that imputations I will not tolerate. At this instance, I'm not prepared to rule the question out of order, but I will rule the last part out. And if it continues and this trend emerges, so everyone's clear, the question will just be ruled out, and we'll move to the next question. I'll give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I don't question the quote that the member for Clark has used about poker machines being the main source of gambling losses in Australia, because that is just a fact.
Before I call the member for Boothby, I was remiss in not reminding the House that Mrs Louise Marcus is also in the gallery today, a former member for Greenway in this place. Give the call to the honourable member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government making education more affordable and more accessible, and is there any opposition to this?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Boothby for her question and thank her and the other South Australian members for hosting us there in the great city of Adelaide yesterday, along with Peter Malinauskas, the Premier of South Australia.
Order. The Leader
this
of the
government does want to help more Australians in both TAFE and university and higher ed. But we want to do more than that as well. We want the continuum of education, from early childhood education and the measures that we've done there, including the 15% pay increase, 10% this December, another 5% next December. The work that the Minister for Education is doing on schools, where we have $16 billion on the table to support essentially the objectives that have been around since the Gonski Review, that would lift the resourcing standard for every student up. And I note that a range of states and territories have already signed up, and we're hoping to get more in coming weeks. But when it comes to higher ed, it is absolutely vital that we invest, because 80% of the students who are currently in primary school will require either a university degree or a TAFE qualification in order to get employment in their post-school years. It's not something that's an add-on, it's something that will be a necessary component. And that's why yesterday we announced that 3 million people will benefit from the 20% cut in student debt. A typical university graduate will see their debt cut by $5,500. That's why we're raising the student debt repayment threshold, so that if you're earning $70,000 a year, you'll save $1,300 a year in repayments. That's why we're making free TAFE permanent. And I met with some apprentices in mechanics who are working at Toyota here in Canberra just before question time, and they're there up in the gallery. The fantastic apprentices who are taking the opportunity to better their lives, but also to make a contribution to our national economy, and that will make an enormous difference. We'll help everyone with student debt now and deliver a better deal for students in the year ahead. Permanent structural reform to boost take-home pay for young Australians, putting more money back into pockets, good for cost of living, good for intergenerational equity, and good for building Australia's future.
Give the call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. For how many months have Australians suffered under Labor's household recession?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the Shadow Treasurer really cared about living standards, he'd support our efforts to ease the cost of living. And if he really cared about living standards, he wouldn't have left us behind real wages falling very substantially, and we've now turned that around and real wages are growing again. And so if he cares about per capita circumstances, and if he cares about living standards in our economy, he should be supporting our efforts to clean up the mess that those opposite left behind. And when we came to office, inflation had a 6 in front of it, it's now got a 2 in front of it. When we came to office, real wages were falling 3.4%. They're growing again, Mr Speaker. And these all go to the very core of the Shadow Treasurer's question about living standards. Now, if he wants to use the per capita measure, Mr Speaker, then he should acknowledge that the per capita measure has gone backwards around 1 in every 3 quarters since the data began. It actually went backwards 4 times under former Prime Minister Morrison, Mr Speaker. And they also recorded—
Order. Members on my right, the member for Spence. The Shadow Treasurer entitled to raise a point of order, and he's going to be given that opportunity now.
Mr Speaker, relevance. It's a very specific question. For how many months have Australians suffered under the Treasurer's household recession?
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the Treasurer has gone to the exact data set that's referred to in the question to compare and contrast. You couldn't be more directly relevant.
I'm just going to order the member for Hume. I'm just going to make sure the data that the Treasurer is reading into the record is relevant to the question. It is not an opportunity for the Treasurer to simply talk about the opposition. It's not an opportunity for the Treasurer to talk about alternative policies, but in the answer he can compare and contrast with the data that he's been asked about the economic question that he's referring to. So I'll listen carefully. Order. I don't know what he's going to say, so we're going to have to listen. But the Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very specifically referring to the exact data set that the Shadow Treasurer is asking me about. And I've pointed out to him that GDP per capita went backwards for consecutive quarters under those opposite, and we have acknowledged in a number of different ways from this dispatch box and outside this parliament that growth in the Australian economy has been very soft and households are doing it tough. People are doing it tough. And the point that I made at the start of my answer, Mr Speaker, and I want to reiterate here, is that if you care about per capita living standards in this economy, you've got two options. You've got two options. One option is to try and help people where you can. That's our approach. And the other option is to oppose wage increases and cost of living help, which is the approach of those opposite, Mr Speaker. So in summary, Mr Speaker, the GDP measure of growth in our economy has been weak under governments of both political persuasions. We acknowledge that. The difference is we're doing something about it. The difference is we're doing something about it. Now, those opposite, when on the weekend, Mr Speaker, when we said that we were going to help students and graduates with student debt, Mr Speaker, this goes right to the core of the question. When we said that we wanted to help people with student debt, Mr Speaker, those opposite said that they opposed it. The reason they said they opposed it was because it didn't apply to everyone. It didn't apply to everyone, Mr Speaker.
The Treasurer wasn't asked about the education policy.
Relevant.
So you'll need to make it directly relevant to the question you were asked.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it's directly relevant because it goes to living standards and helping people who are doing it tough, Mr Speaker. The point that I'm making is this. When we tried to give a tax cut to every taxpayer, they said it was too broad. Now that we're helping with student debt, they say it's too narrow. Make up your mind, Mr Speaker. They need to decide, do they care about per capita living standards or not? If they do, they should support our efforts to help people with the cost of living.
We'll hear from the honourable member for Higgins.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Youth. Young people in my community have told me that cost is a huge barrier to them pursuing education after school. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to make sure young people can access further education?
Call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education and the Minister for Youth.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for her question, but also for her continued advocacy. And the member for Higgins, like many of the members on this side of the House, has had those consultations with young people, has gone out there and spoken to young people in her electorate, and I'm really grateful for the question, bringing it here to the parliament. And Mr Speaker, last year we held national consultations with around 5,000 young people right across Australia to talk to them about the issues that matter most to them. And they told us that cost of living was their #1 issue. Their #1 issue was cost of living. Education and training was among the top 5 issues that young people most care about. Now, we've heard from young Australians that they are acutely feeling cost of living pressures, and they are struggling, particularly with the cost of higher and further education. In fact, Mr Speaker, if I may, one respondent to our National Youth Survey said this. They said, "I would love to study more and I would love to upskill. However, university is so expensive that I don't feel it's an option for me." Right, to have a young person say that they don't feel that higher education is an option for them. Now, at a youth roundtable that I held with the member for Perth in Perth recently, participants who were school students told us that they were worried about taking on the debt associated with going to university. And another survey respondent said this to us. He said, "Making education cheaper, whether it's university, school or TAFE, would lead to greater success among young people." That's what we're hearing from young people. That's directly the words of young people telling us what matters to them, cost of living and the cost of education. And that's why, Mr Speaker, this government is taking action. That's why we announced that we'd slash student debt by 20% for everyone. Now, that means that for the average university student, that's around a $5,500 cut from their HECS debt. That's significant for young people who are struggling with the cost of living. We're raising the threshold which universities have to start repaying their debt, meaning people can pay off their debts more easily. But, Mr Speaker, not all young people need to go to university, not all young people want to go to university, and not all young people should go to university. TAFE is a really important, TAFE and vocational education, a really important component of higher education. And we want to make sure that young people can access TAFE. That's why we have a $1.5 billion investment for fee-free TAFE and VET places, already supporting 500,000 student enrolments since January last year. That's why we're bringing the cost down for young Australians. We're opening doors for them to pursue education and to build a better future for themselves and for Australia.
The call to the honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When the Prime Minister was elected, the official cash rate was 0.35%. Without reference to the Treasurer, can the Prime Minister inform the House as to what the cash rate is today?
Order. No. Order. The Minister for Infrastructure is now warned. I couldn't hear the question because people were interjecting. This is the problem. If I can't hear the question, I can't then make rulings on relevance and whatnot. So, out of respect for the member for Hughes, I'll invite her to ask the question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When the Prime Minister was elected, the cash rate was 0.35%. Without reference to the Treasurer, can the Prime Minister inform the House as to what the cash rate is today?
The member for Lingiari is warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
We understand that interest rates have caused pressure on Australian households. And of course interest rates, we have seen a series of increases, 13 of them, which began under the former government, to the point whereby the Reserve Bank will meet tomorrow, and the rate is, of course, 4.35. But that is less than. But that is less than the United Kingdom, where it's 5. It's less than New Zealand, which is 4.75. It's less than the United States, which is 5. And the shadow treasurer interjects. That's because they were higher than us. That's why they're coming down, but off a higher point, because inflation peaked higher and earlier in those economies. But what we have seen with last week, with the inflation rate, with the 2 in front of it, the monthly rate going down to 2.1, I remember the March 2022 quarter, where the quarterly figure was 2.1. The quarterly figure was 2.1. So the last quarter in which they were in office was 2.1, the same as an annual figure that was released last week. The 4 figures last week all came down, every indicator of inflation, and that is because of a range of measures, including the delivery of 2 budget surpluses, something that would be unrecognisable by those opposite. And bear this in mind. They promised before the 2013 election that they would deliver a surplus the first year and every year thereafter. And one of the reasons why inflation was such a problem in Australia, as the COVID inquiry report confirmed, was the wasteful expenditure, giving $20 billion to companies that weren't seeing a decrease in their revenue, some of which were seeing an increase in their revenue, some of which were seeing an increase in their revenue. Now, the cash rate under the Leader of the Opposition as Assistant Treasurer was 6.75%.
Give the call to the honourable member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. How is the Albanese Labor government supporting Australians to reach their full potential by removing financial barriers to study? And how does this compare with other approaches?
Call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Thanks, Speaker, and I thank my friend the member for Aston for her question. She knows that the Albanese government has put public TAFE back at the centre of training. Under our government, more than 500,000 people have taken up the opportunities of a fee-free TAFE place. We've opened the door for Australians to get the skills they want and which our economy needs to build Australia's future. And, Speaker, Australians are seizing that opportunity. 35,000 enrolments in construction courses, the same in early education, 50,000 in digital technology, 130,000 in aged and disability care. There is no doubt, Speaker, that free TAFE is changing lives, and that is why we are locking it in. As the Prime Minister announced in Adelaide yesterday, the Albanese Labor government will introduce legislation to establish fee-free TAFE as an enduring feature of our national vocational education and training system. This will be funding 100,000 free TAFE places a year, every year, from 2027. And this will give certainty to students, to industry, to TAFEs and the community. It will help give job seekers a fresh start. It will support more young people training for a new career and assist more older workers who are skilling up for a new opportunity. After a decade of neglect from those opposite, the Albanese government is committed to rebuilding the vocational education and training sector. And free TAFE is supporting a prosperous and equitable Australia, removing financial barriers to education and training and delivering a coordinated response to workforce shortages. And it gives Australians the confidence to study. Now, I met Grayson in Frankston. He's a fee-free TAFE student studying a Cert 4 in mental health. This is what he told me. I struggled a lot in high school and I never thought I'd study again. I was never going back to studying. But what helped him make his decision was that the pressure of money had been removed. Not having to think about that meant that he was confident to go on to further education. And now he says he really, really loved his time in the course. I also met Christy and Logan Lee, who's studying towards a diploma of nursing. She said this: "It felt like the right time to take the next step in my career, and fee-free TAFE is a huge help. The financial support has allowed me to focus on my studies without worrying about tuition costs. Nursing careers will always be in demand, and no artificial intelligence can replace the compassion and empathy nurses provide." She urges others to take up these opportunities and says this: being free is a massive bonus. I agree with Christie, Speaker, and as long as there is a Labor government, free TAFE is here to stay.
Yeah. Call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, given the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has said divestiture-like powers would be useful to have in the toolkit, why won't the Prime Minister stand up for families and farmers against the big supermarkets and back the coalition supermarket proposals introduced to Parliament today, including tough new court-ordered divestiture powers?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the Leader of the Nationals for his question about a really important issue, and that's how we make sure that when it comes to our supermarkets we get a fair go for farmers and families. That's our objective as a Labor government, Mr Speaker. Not that long ago, in the last couple of weeks or so, I stood next to the chair of the ACCC, the terrific chair of the ACCC, who was asked about divestiture powers. And the point that the chair made then and the point that I want to make now is the things that we are doing to crack down on the supermarkets will make the sorts of powers that the Leader of the National Party is talking about today unnecessary. If we get in at the start and prevent the kinds of mergers which are anti-competitive, we get in and do the right thing in the ways that the legislation that Assistant Minister Lee and Minister Jones and I have been working on, then we can get the right kind of outcome without going towards these sorts of proposals. And the reasons why we should be very wary about the proposals that the Leader of the Nationals has put forward today is we want to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences when it comes to divestiture. Divestiture powers are a blunt instrument. They are rarely used in any other jurisdiction. And frankly, Mr Speaker, we've got better ways to crack down on anti-competitive behaviour, especially when it comes to supermarkets. Now, Mr Speaker, we don't see any evidence anywhere in the world of where breaking up the major supermarkets is working. If you force one supermarket to divest, and the only viable buyer is another big supermarket chain, then that divestiture makes things worse. It makes things less competitive, not more competitive, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Now, I finish on this point, Mr Speaker. The merger that risks consumers the most in this country right now is this very bizarre merger between the Greens political party, the Liberals and the National Party. This is the merger which should trouble Australian consumers the most, Mr Speaker. This is the merger that risks doing the most damage to people who are struggling to make ends meet, Mr Speaker. This bizarre and unholy alliance between the Greens, the Nats and the Liberal Party, Mr Speaker. This Labor government is doing a number of things to make our supermarket sector more competitive, and that's because we want a fair go for farmers and families. The difference between this side of the House and that side of the House, and frankly up there as well, is they just get to write these kind of neatly worded press releases. We've actually got to run the place, and we're making our economy more competitive in a range of ways, and we're working very closely with the wonderful ACCC chair as we do it.
I'll hear from the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. How is the Albanese Labor government supporting more Australians into apprenticeships and more apprentices to become tradies to reach the ambitious goal of building 1.2 million homes after a wasted decade?
Call to the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Homelessness.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Hawke for his question. He is a hugely powerful advocate in this parliament for a better housing deal for our constituents because it matters so much to the people that he came here to represent. Speaker, in Hawke, as in Hotham, as in every part of our country, Australians are doing it tough, and housing costs are a really big part of this picture. We hear it from our constituents. We all talk to young people in our electorate, Speaker, who describe that intense feeling of despair they feel when they've just missed out on another rental application. A feeling they say they talk about this fact that they don't know when they're going to get secure and affordable housing over their heads. Speaker, we talk to young families who a generation ago or a generation before that would absolutely have been in home ownership already, but today are stuck in a rent trap with that dream of home ownership going further and further away. So, Speaker, at the core of all these issues is actually something quite straightforward. Australia has not been building enough housing in this country for more than a generation. And that's why our government is working with the states to build more homes, because the more homes we build, the more affordable housing for all Australians. Now, if we're going to build more homes, Speaker, we're going to need more tradies. We're going to need more plumbers, more sparkies, more tilers and bricklayers. And yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that a Labor government would continue its transformative support of TAFE, with a commitment to deliver 100,000 fee-free TAFE places every year. Speaker, this is absolutely massive. It will permanently remove this cost barrier to training for 100,000 people in our country every year. And, Speaker, as a Labor government, we know that when we offer Australians opportunities like this, they grab them with both hands. Since we introduced fee-free TAFE in 2023, more than 500,000 people have taken up this opportunity of free training. 35,000 of those have been in occupations which are critical to construction and housing. We stumped up another $86 billion to work with states and territories to fund another 20,000 fee-free TAFE and VET places in courses critical to construction and housing. Now, Speaker, we arrived in office to find our country in the grips of the worst labour shortage that we've experienced in our country since the Second World War. And part of that problem was the decade of neglect and cuts that we saw to education, to training and to apprentices. And if that has a familiar ring to it, it's because this is what we can expect from the Liberals if they get into office in what they're offering on housing. Speaker, the latest tabulation shows that the Liberals now are planning to cut $19 billion from our government's commitments to housing. I mean, what a bizarre and inexplicable thing to do, to cut housing funding in the middle of a housing crisis. Now, we're taking a different approach, a bold and ambitious $32 billion housing agenda, building more homes, getting a better deal for renters and getting more Australians into the dream of home ownership.
Before I call the Leader of the Australian Greens, the member for Fisher has been getting a pretty good go. He is now warned. Give the call to the Leader of the Australian Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. we welcome Labor adopting Greens' policy to start to cancel student debt, but why are you waiting for an election to legislate this? Will you commit to introducing legislation on debt cancellation and changing the repayment thresholds this week so that we can pass it by the end of this month, giving people debt relief and certainty now?
Order. The member for Bennelong, the member for Cunningham and the member for Fremantle are all warned for interjecting before even someone has begun their answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I really do thank the member for Melbourne for that question, because the member for Melbourne leads a political party that is combining with the coalition over there in the other place to hold up legislation, including legislation not from the last budget but from the budget beforehand. The budget beforehand. And as a direct result, take for example our Help to Buy legislation. Help to Buy legislation, something that we took to the last election.
Order.
Something just like what they did with the HAF. They actually have motions moved in the Senate between the Greens and the Coalition where they defer things off into the never-never and say we can't talk about it until, in this case, until the November sittings. Well, we have in the November sittings as well aged care reform. We have, when it comes to the environmental reform that's there to create a national EPA for the first time, but the Greens and the Coalition holding that up in the Senate. We already have, of course, legislation that would reduce the debt for 3 million Australians by changing the indexation rules on HECS. I'm not sure whether the Greens political party have committed to amend that or support that. I'm not sure, because even when things are their policy, they say that they're not voting for it. They say they're not voting for it unless you change tax policy or you change this or that. The fact is that what we are doing, and we will do this across a range of areas, and it began yesterday. There's a range of legislation that we have committed to for this term. We want to see carried either this year or when Parliament sits next year. And then there is, of course, legislation committing to a second-term agenda of what we will do as well. So we make no apologies for this period out from an election of saying what a re-elected Labor government will do. And a re-elected Labor government will continue to prioritise and build on what we have done already. So we've already done 500,000 fee-free TAFE places. We'll make it permanent. We've already reduced the debt for Australian graduates, whether it be of apprentices or university graduates. We'll do more as well.
The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. Call to the honourable member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. How will the Albanese Labor government's commitments to continue free TAFE, introduce paid prac for nursing students, cut all student debts by 20% and give aged care workers a pay rise help to build and strengthen the aged care workforce?
Call to the Minister for Aged Care and the Minister for Sport.
I thank the member for Spence for his question, for his personal commitment to making sure that every opportunity is available to young people in his electorate. Mr Speaker, for the last 2.5 years, the Albanese government has been on a mission to lift the quality of aged care in Australia, to make a career in aged care something that you aspire to create a better life for yourself, to make sure that whether you are a kitchen hand in Perth, a personal care worker in Dalby or a registered nurse in Randwick, you feel valued, respected and that the doors of opportunity are open for you. We have ensured workers get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, investing $15.1 billion to deliver a pay rise in aged care. And underneath the Albanese Labor government, registered nurses are now taking home an additional $196 per week, or more than $10,000 a year extra. Personal care workers are now taking home an additional $141 per week, or $7,300 a year extra. And then we delivered a tax cut so that workers aren't just earning more, but keeping more of what they earn. A registered nurse on a level 1.3 award wage is receiving a tax cut of $1,745. A personal care worker with Certificate 3 qualification is receiving a tax cut of $1,166. Our work to support and strengthen the aged care workforce has not stopped there. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that if re-elected, the Albanese government will wipe 20% of student debt for everyone and make minimum repayments fairer. For a registered nurse with a $20,000 HECS debt, they will see $4,000 wiped off their bill. Wow. A personal care worker earning $60,000 will have to pay back $600 a year less. And to make sure we're not just growing the workforce, but growing a skilled workforce, we will continue to fund fee-free TAFE. Yeah. So far, 130,000 students have taken up this opportunity in aged care and in disability care. I travelled to far north Queensland and met with a personal care worker named Clyde who had Cert 3. He told me that he was only able to do his Cert 3 because of Labor's pay rise. He told me that he wants to go on now and do Certificate 4 and then eventually get his bachelor's, all while continuing his career in aged care. Well, I have good news for Clyde. Under a re-elected Albanese government, fee-free TAFE is here to stay. And that's what we've been working towards, and that's who we have been working for people like Clyde, who have aspirations to create a better life for themselves and for their families. Those opposite might think that these jobs don't matter, but I can tell you care economy jobs are real jobs. They're looking after older Australians. What job could be more real?
Call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The IMF projects that Australia's inflation is expected to be the second highest of any advanced economy in 2015. Australia is at the back of the pack when it comes to fighting and beating inflation. Will this Prime Minister take responsibility for the cost of living pain Australian families are feeling today?
The Treasurer has the call. Order. The Minister will cease rejecting.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think he meant 2025 rather than 2015. He might want to check that, and no doubt he can fix the Hansard later, Mr Speaker. He's only a decade out. Mr Speaker, I think it is unfortunately dishonest of the Shadow Treasurer to ask a question about inflation without acknowledging the very welcome and very encouraging data we got just last Wednesday. And that showed that the inflation that we inherited at 6.1 is now 2.8%, Mr Speaker. He could have mentioned that. And he could have mentioned as well that if he wants to ask me a question about headline inflation, he shouldn't have spent the last 6 months saying that headline inflation doesn't matter, only underlying inflation matters. He's got to make up his mind which one of those he wants to use, Mr Speaker. And if he's going to ask me about inflation, he should fess up to their shameful record on inflation, when inflation was more than twice what it is now on our watch. Inflation was much higher and rising under them, and it's much lower and falling under us. Now, he asked me about the IMF report, Mr Speaker, and I'm obviously not going to read to him the IMF report. I assume he has someone who turns the IMF reports into little cartoons that he can understand. But I will say this about the IMF report, Mr Speaker. The IMF has valuable insights to make. The IMF has valuable insights to share with the global economic community. And we have our own forecast, which we'll update the usual way in the mid-year update. And the Reserve Bank has their own forecast, which they'll update actually this week, as it turns out. And I know that those forecasts, like the ones that he asked me about, are always the subject, rightly, of a lot of focus and a lot of attention. But I say this, and this is a bit like what the Prime Minister said a moment ago. If you want to make comparisons between countries, make the full comparisons. Inflation peaked lower and later here than in most other countries. Rates started rising here later than most other countries. They rose by less and had a lower peak here than in most other countries when it comes to interest rates and inflation similarly. And if you want to compare us to other countries, acknowledge that a lot of countries have got higher unemployment than us as well. A lot of other countries have got weaker economies than we do, Mr Speaker. Two-thirds of the OECD had a negative quarter, at least one negative quarter in the last year, Mr Speaker. So I say to the Shadow Treasurer, if he wants to make comparisons, make the whole comparison. And while he's talking about the IMF, the IMF said last week, Mr Speaker, that when those opposite were in charge, we had the 14th strongest budget in the world. Now we're top 3. Now we're top 3, Mr Speaker.
Order. The Treasurer will just pause so the Prime Minister will cease interjecting so I can hear from the Shadow Treasurer on a point of order.
Speaker, you're showing a lot of lenience to the Treasurer, but the truth is the question asked for a compare and contrast with other countries on inflation, not between the government and other times.
Order. No, we'll just do this in a matter-of-fact, orderly way. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the point of order on relevance. The question was about 2015. The Shadow Treasurer misread the entire question. The Treasurer is doing his best with what was given to say something relevant to Australia now. But when what is put is about a period that is a decade ago, then to take a point of order on relevance is a real stretch.
Order. No. Members on my right. The member. We're not going to do anything until the House comes to order. The member for Bruce and the member for Holt. No, it doesn't work that way. People are entitled to raise points of order, and they will be shown respect while they are doing it. The member for Wannon on a point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. And further the point from the Leader of the House, it is not being directly relevant when you're not addressing Slovakia and the comparison with Slovakia that the question asked, and that was what the question asked.
Order. 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 Just order. I know it's the beginning of the week. The opposition are entitled to ask questions. I'm just going to remind the Treasurer I want him to be tighter with his answers, and I want to make sure he's being directly relevant. I'm listening carefully to the figures. I haven't heard him mention the country Slovakia yet. He may order. He may come to that, but I can't make him say what you'd like him to say. But I will make sure he is being directly relevant, and I just want him to conclude in the last 17 seconds on that point. Order.
Mr Speaker, inflation peaked lower and later in this country than in other countries, and any honest comparison would acknowledge that. And if you want to ask me about IMF comparisons, ask us about the one that says we've gone from 14th under you to on the podium under this Prime Minister.
Order. The House comes to order. We shall hear from the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. What have been the results from the Albanese Labor government's same job, same pay laws? What has been the response to these changes?
Great question. Give the call to the Minister representing the Minister for Workplace Relations.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Hunter, who came to this place fighting for same job, same pay laws. And for workers in the electorate of Hunter and around Australia, they started in effect on Friday. So now those laws that those on this side supported and those opposite opposed are finding their way into people's pay packets. And there is the question asks about the response, the results and the response. The results are now in people's pay packets, and the response from those opposite is that this is all at risk at the election. This is one of the areas they have targeted and said that the opposition leader has announced they would get rid of.
He might not like costed policies, but he really likes policies that cost. Policies that cost workers, policies that cost households. Batchfire mine in Queensland. 320 labour hire workers will receive pay rises of up to $20,000 a year. Every dollar at risk under those opposite. Australian Country Choice Production Meatworks. Meat workers' unions estimated that 200 labour hire workers there are now getting a pay rise of up to $500 a week. At Qantas, because we stood up to Qantas when Qantas were arguing that labour hire workers should be underpaid. In fact, what did the Leader of the Opposition say? And I quote the Leader of the Opposition. His words were this.
The member Barker.
Full credit to Alan Joyce. Full credit to Alan Joyce for labour hire workers to be paid less. And yet, 2,450 cabin crew at Qantas are being converted to direct employment, seeing pay rises of $300 a week. 800 labour hire flight attendants, pay rises up 28%. The coalition called same job, same pay a made-up issue. Senator Hume said workers getting these wage increases would be, and I quote, the worst thing. We now need to find out from the Leader of the Opposition, is his plan on repealing these laws to directly cut their pay, to freeze their pay, to allow labour hire back in so that they're simply made redundant and have to come back and apply for their own jobs? No matter which way you cut it, the policies that those opposite are taking to the election put these pay rises at direct threat and say to these workers, those opposite believe that they're being paid too much and they want to cut their pay.
Give a call to the honourable member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. The Headstone project undertakes valuable work identifying unmarked graves of World War I veterans and then providing them with a modest headstone. A request for deductible gift recipient status by Headstone Project South Australia was denied last December, despite its Tasmanian counterpart receiving GDR status in 2020. An appeal regarding the DGR status was lodged last month. As Treasurer, will you support the Headstone Project South Australia and overturn this decision?
Order. The member for McEwen will leave the chamber under 94A. To simply be interjecting during a question is highly disorderly. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member for Mayo for her question as well. I undertake to her that I'll have another look at the most recent application that's been made. The truth is we get many more applications than we can afford to fund. We do our best working closely with Assistant Minister Lee to work out how we impose some sort of order and some sort of priority on those.
Order.
But if there's been some kind of obvious issue here with this one, then I'm obviously happy to take another look.
Call to the honourable member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. What progress has the Albanese Labor government made in the fight against inflation, and what obstacles are standing in the way?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the outstanding member for Robertson for his question. Now, you wouldn't know it from those opposite, Mr Speaker, but since Parliament last sat, we got quarterly and monthly inflation numbers for September. Inflation at 2.8% was the lowest in almost 4 years. Inflation is now in the Reserve Bank's target range for the first time since 2021. And underlying inflation came down substantially as well, and it's now the lowest it's been in almost 3 years. And monthly inflation came down to 2.1%. So headline, underlying and monthly inflation all came down quite a bit, Mr Speaker. And that means we are making welcome, encouraging, heartening progress in the fight against inflation, but we know that people are still doing it tough, and we know that the fight isn't over yet. But when we came to office, inflation was much higher and rising. Now it is much lower and falling. When we came to office, it had a 6 in front of it, and now it has a 2 in front of it under us, Mr Speaker. Inflation is back in the target band and our policies are helping. We are coming at this cost of living challenge from every conceivable and responsible angle. And the announcements that the PM and Education and Skills Ministers made on the weekend go to those cost of living efforts that we are making as a government. The energy rebates, they're also making a welcome difference, but they don't tell the whole story. Our 2 surpluses are helping as well. This is something that the Reserve Bank Governor has herself acknowledged. When it comes to the fight against inflation, our responsible economic management, whether it's the 2 surpluses, the way we're designing our cost of living help, that is helping in the fight against inflation, and we are making good progress. The inflation numbers last week were welcome and they were encouraging. Now, as always, Mr Speaker, those opposite, they pore over them looking for any anti-government angle because they desperately want inflation to be higher. They desperately want inflation and interest rates to be higher because it suits their political purposes. But if you step back for a moment from the politics and the partisanship and consider what Australia has achieved under this Prime Minister, inflation has more than halved. Real wages are growing again. 1 million jobs created in a single parliamentary term for the first time ever. Tax cuts for every taxpayer. 2 surpluses. $150 billion less debt, saving $80 billion in debt interest. That's what responsible economic management looks like, Mr Speaker. And this is the progress which is at risk under the reckless arrogance of the opposition leader and the callous cluelessness of his hopeless shadow treasurer. We are managing the economy in the interests of the Australian people, supporting them in tough times, getting inflation down, all of these outcomes unrecognisable to those opposite.
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions placed on the notice.